Welcome to another podcast from I'dRatherBeWriting.com. My name is Tom Johnson. Today I'm talking with Claudio Duscalesco and about Archbee, which is a new documentation tool that is pretty cool. I was playing around with it, and it's got a really engaging editor. It makes it easy to author content, especially if you're writing developer docs. It's a product that's got a lot of great reviews on Product Hunt and elsewhere. They've been a sponsor of my site. You've probably seen the ads and so on, and maybe have been curious about what Archbee is. Well, this is the podcast where you can learn more about it. We're going to give you more details. So, Claudio, can you just introduce yourself a little bit, your name, kind of what your role is, how long you've been at Archbee?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me to the podcast, Tom. It's great to talk about Archbee, but also documentation in general and what I've seen in the market for the past 1.5 years. That's basically the time I've spent with Archbee. I'm a growth marketer at Archbee, and I've been diving deep into the communities, trying to understand how software companies build documentation, what they need. So trying to build that feedback loop back into the product to actually build something great. And until now, I think we managed to build something really cool.
Great. I want to start out with kind of the origin story of Archbee. And in the Product Hunt post and introduction to Archbee, Dragos Buligian, I'm sure I'm not saying that right, but it's close, hopefully close. Dragos, the founder, kind of relates this story of how it came about. Let me just read a few of the passages. He says, version 0 of Archbee in 2018, stuck in a hotel room in Frankfurt. It was raining, and I decided to code a software diagramming tool for architects. Scrapped the product after a few months of getting no traction. Next bullet, Archbee version 1, restarted in early 2019 with the idea for an internal docs tool for engineering teams that would include API docs, Markdown, diagrams, change logs, and GitHub integration. After realizing all the tools out there, Google Docs, Confluence, Notion, were built for anybody but not tech people. The product was getting some customers organically, but did not show great traction either. Then skip ahead to Archbee version 2. This version was just an improved, better looking, less buggy version of version 1. Launched it on Product Hunt 2020 and got it to number 1. However, most of the traction was coming from a wimpy feature, publishing docs on customers' domains. And then finally, talking to customers, we realized there are still no great tools for building public product and developer docs for folks who don't want the DIY approach. Basically, no way of onboarding and activating your tech audiences without spending a ton of energy on docs tech. So it's a cool story. I love this kind of notion of somebody who's like techie enough that they can just start building the tools that they need, and obviously you combine computer engineering skills with design skills toward a specific pain point around documentation, especially for developers, one that integrates Markdown, graphics, API docs in a push button way. Could tell that was a real pain point he was trying to solve. So, question. So, tell me more about this story. What comments do you have on it? For example, does Archbee have certain functionality that is kind of missing in other documentation tools? What sort of gap was Dragos hoping to fill with this new tool?
Yeah, great question. And from you breaking down the story, probably we already noticed some pivots there, right? Starting off as a software that basically helps architects document their project, to actually getting to a place where you can publish your documentation to a custom domain, right? So a lot of pivots there. So the story is that it's more than just a particular task or a feature. It's about who contributes to the documentation, right? So at the end of the day, writing documentation is basically a team sport, right? So most of the time, the knowledge is trapped in the minds of engineers, product people, you have your subject matter experts. There are people that, this is not their core job, writing documentation, right? So they basically need to go in, contribute, go out, and continue doing their great things, their day-to-day, right? But it's still this gap that probably many products don't actually cover. The bridge with, that you have advanced features, advanced documentation features that basically technical writer teams actually use, but put that in a collaborative workspace where anybody can contribute. So from your engineer to your non-technical, whatever, product manager, let's say, right? So it's more than just a specific task or a feature. It's about the culture, right? And documentation is about culture at the end of the day, right? So yeah, this is where Archbee comes in. It's not about having a great feature or the best feature or the feature that doesn't exist in other tools. It's about having the streamlined platform to build documentation and empower that documentation culture software companies actually need to thrive. So that's the extension of the story. A lot of pivots, but everything's relates to this. Anybody can and should contribute to the documentation.
Yeah, and I just want to reflect on that a minute. This notion of more of the collaborative authoring, it's definitely the trend that I've been writing about on my blog for a while. I was just giving a presentation about how things are getting more and more specialized. It's getting harder as a tech writer to try to author everything from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
I have to, I really want engineering teams to kind of write their own docs. They created the feature. Why can't they just, describe it? And then I can edit it or something. But to enable them to plug into an authoring tool and not require them to know some advanced publishing tool or syntax, is kind of key. Getting that sort of collaborative platform to enable multiple people contributing is key, I think, and is definitely aligned with this increasing direction of more and more specialization that we see. So yeah, great. Let's see. Let's dive in a little bit more into Archbee. So you launched officially around early 2019, according to the timeline. And you've had quite a few. I mean, on Product Hunt, you've got 5-star reviews from lots and lots of people. What do you think is sort of the feature that's drawing people to Archbee? What are they? You mentioned this collaborative platform and everything, but what do you think accounts for this rapid rise in customer growth?
Mm-hmm. I think it basically builds on exactly what you said, and you've noticed as a trend, right? The reality is that we shouldn't justify why documentation is important, right? I've posted a meme recently about what's the ROI of documentation, and got some pretty interesting comments there. It's hard to to justify sometimes the importance of documentation. But if you basically question whether you should write documentation or not, you should probably do it, right? So, but at the same time, why doesn't any team out there basically write documentation? Especially small teams, they basically don't do that. And what I've seen is that you have productivity apps with high adoption across organizations, the Notions of the world and stuff like that, but they have little support for writing software documentation. So basically what you have is you have your teams in a tool that doesn't support the writing of documentation. So yeah, at the end of the day, product documentation is one of the first contacts of the new users of a product. To new users will go to the documentation site or self-service knowledge base, however you want to call it. So when Archbee launched this option to host documentation on a custom domain, that's what ticked most with our clients, right? So this is the most relevant feature, because all the teams out there want the product documentation to be great for their users. And when you basically launch your documentation on a custom domain, it has so many other use cases. For example, we added features like you can gate the content, authenticate just customers. You can also build the simple self-service knowledge base for your product. We have clients that build developer portals for their API docs or SDKs. So basically, this is just the beginning. Like most clients expand and they start to use Archbee as an internal wiki. recently, I even talked with a startup CEO who started to use Archbee for his personal notes. So again, it ties to what I said earlier. It's not like a specific feature, or maybe the most relevant feature is the fact that you can publish documentation. And this is what makes teams go in, write, and do something, because it's their users that need to read that. But after they go over this step, they see the value in writing documentation, so they start to do it internally. They started to do it, even at the personal level, like in the example earlier. So yeah. That's
I feel like this, some of these points are hitting on having a tool that's simple for people to figure out, that almost feels wiki-like or like a Google Docs thing in terms of the ability to just plug in and start authoring content, but then adding all these necessary features for documentation. I mean, if you've ever tried to write documentation in Google Docs and you want to like highlight a code sample, well,
Yep.
you have to kind of like manually change the font and the size, and it's like it's a hack, and yet tools like Google Docs and other wiki tools, they do make it push button simple for people to get in there, so
Yep.
so that balance between like, hey, I've got just enough features to make this viable as a documentation tool, but it's also not like intimidating to people. That's a difficult balance. When I was playing around with Archbee, I was struck by the ease of the editor. That there was if I'm remembering correctly, it's kind of like you put a slash, you type a
Yep.
slash, and then you're prompted with lots of like little widgets or boilerplate formatting kind of thing for code samples. And you mentioned that editor is what people love most about Archbee, right? Is that still the case?
Yeah, that's still the case. It brings that balance where you have those blocks that are easy to understand for most people that have used most of the tools out there, but also it has the markdown support. You can use shortcuts, and it ties to other tools like Jira, GitHub. So there's a lot of things that go into the editor, but at the end of the day, it's simple to use. If you're a new user, not techie, let's say, you can go in and write something there, even if it's not software documentation.
And let's talk specifically about the API doc features. Let's say you do have a REST API and you're trying to publish that. Archbee has specific features that accommodate REST API publication, right?
Yep.
And that might seem like a small point, but it's not like at all. This is one of the most common questions I would get on my site is like, okay, I've got my doc site and now I've got my Swagger output. How do I merge the two? Like my documentation experience is fragmented and search doesn't work across both of these, and I've got different styles. People are always like, well, how do I, get my Swagger output published within my docs as well? Do you find that that's like how does Archbee handle that?
Yeah, there's so much to talk about here because you get so what happens, especially with APIs, right? That's what if you're building a product and you launch your API, it's basically the connection with the developers, right? It's what developers will use to implement the product. So we have I've worked with fintech companies that need to publish their API, and for them this is like this is how they make money, right? They need to have everything in one place. They need to have their API references in a what we call in Archbee a space, but also they need to add to that like tutorials, how-to guides. There's a lot of things that goes with an API. You cannot always just publish the API and expect everybody to use it as it is, right? Especially for for companies like in the financial sector. So to that point, the way we do it is we offer a bunch of options to document the API. So if you're using a standard, we have a Swagger file, you can basically import the file and we automatically generate the references for you. Even more, if you want to make this fully to be fully in sync, you can use our API. So each time you build a new file, you can basically run an additional command, and everything is synced directly in Archbee. So you don't need to go in and change, whatever you need to change in terms of the API references. That's one thing. And secondly, we make it really easy to build multi-product or multi-product types of portals. So you would have three different tabs, let's say, where you can break your documentation into what I've seen, something like API docs, tutorials, and your getting started guide. So everything is in one place, same style, same login if you want to do that. So that's how we basically do it. And if you don't have a standard file like the Swagger file or OpenAPI file, you can export a Postman collection and import that, and it works similarly. We just generate the API references. And there are other ways you can do it directly from the editor. We have blocks called API endpoint, Swagger UI. Those are the situations where you need to go in and manually describe the call instead of just dynamically generating it from a file, if that makes sense. So we have a bunch of options there. And people are really happy to have a single platform where they can bring together the developer experience, but also like the tutorials. I like to call them tutorials, but not sure if this is the best phrasing.
No, that's good. That's a common way of referring to it, and I think that's that's an amazing integration. Honestly, the fact that Archbee has sort of been designed and developed at a time when REST APIs were very popular and common, and therefore become part of this natural doc type that it handles, I think is really a point worth driving home, because so many of the other documentation tools out there, they're sort of they were designed before REST APIs were popular. If they handle them, it's clunky, or it's not really a seamless experience. It's almost like Archbee was designed with this paradigm in mind, and the many options that you listed, the ability to export from a Postman collection, that's even better, because then you can just really play around with that, in Postman, and not sacrifice any kind of weird workflow trying to like maintain the open API spec somewhere else. But yeah, it's cool. All right, well, let's talk about a couple other things. So as a documentation tool, you also have a couple of components that a lot of people are usually curious about, especially when we're talking about Markdown. You've got content reuse and some variables with variables and content snippets. These are usually high value sort of content types for tech writers, because we don't want to have a bunch of duplicate instances of things. We might have multiple versions of the same guide. We might have different brand names or different audience types. Can you talk about like what kind of content reuse Archbee offers?
Yeah, we launched this feature April this year, 2022. So this is actually the most requested feature from technical writers. As you mentioned, there are two types of reusable pieces of content. You have variables and content snippets. And with variables, it's pretty straightforward. You can save a variable with up to 100 characters. And you can add them across the documentation. I think this is the most common way to reuse a piece of content, probably, right? But with content snippets, on the other side, I think the way we implemented this is it's again tied with our, the way we look at documentation. It's actually really easy for anybody to go in and use content snippets. We actually have a product manager that builds the documentation, or owns the documentation, let's say, for 5 different customers. But it's basically the same documentation. You just need to change a couple of things based on their tier, so on and so forth. So what happens with content snippets is that you go in, you define the content of a document. So the thing here is that, and maybe we should talk a little bit more about the Archbee editor, right? The idea is that when you define the content snippet, and what makes it excellent is that you have access to all of the blocks, So the blocks are the way you can add multimedia files, code snippet, API references if that's what you need. But at the same time, you can use Markdown shortcuts if you want. So you basically save the content of a document in a content snippet, and then you go in and exactly like you said, you just populate the document, whatever you need. So what happens is that you would have a document with either one or multiple content snippets added there. So the use case that I've seen most of the time is when you need to share documentation with different clients, but let's say 80% of the documentation, it's the same because you have the same things that need to be implemented. So you just go in, define the content snippets, you put them in your documents, and you have a single place where you need to go in and edit them. No need to manage multiple documents. And if you're a technical writer, you basically know exactly how this works. But the main power is that you have the full features of the editor. You're not limited to what you can define in a content snippet.
That's cool. That's cool. You mentioned you can even reuse components of the API reference. Is that right?
We have a block called API endpoint. So if you add that block to a content snippet, that means you can reuse that block across multiple documents, right? So you cannot basically reuse. So an API endpoint will have the description, responses, so on and so forth. You basically use the entire definition of the API call, not pieces of that call, if that makes sense, right? So
yeah,
that's
cool.
how it goes.
Great. Yeah, it's kind of interesting to hear that the content reuse is one of the highly requested features from tech writers, because I have heard that question come up over the years from a number of tools. People, tech writers are sort of caught in this trap where we want to use Markdown and be as simple as possible, but then we want like content reuse and we want to have like PDF output and versioning and all these advanced things, translation round tripping. So that's like tension between, I want to have this robust tool that does whatever I want, but I also want it to be drop dead simple. is like an impossible balance. But it sounds like Archbee is finding a good compromise and providing the features that they need. Now, okay, this is kind of a larger question, and I alluded to this just moments ago, but I've seen a lot of tools come and go over the years, and I feel like if there's a common theme, it's that people start out with these huge ambitions. They realize, hey, the tools market in TechCom is kind of poor. We can do so much better. They don't have modern tools. It looks like, they're using ancient stuff. They jump in, then they have success. They build a cool tool, but then they realize, you know what? There aren't that many tech writers in the world. Such a small community. How can we be profitable? And then they disappear. So how do you what's your general strategy? How can tech writers feel like Archbee is going to be here for the long term, or like how are you avoiding building a tool that will only appeal to this small community of tech writers?
Yeah, totally get the question. And there are a couple of points here. So first of all, what I've seen is that basically the market is really fragmented, right? You have so many options to write documentation from. I've seen situations where even large companies use Google Docs to write their documentation, or they just use PDFs, to share with their clients. So I think we can agree that that's not the best way to do it, probably, right? But you also have data, docs as code. I feel the market is fragmented. That's the point, right? So the target audience for Archbee is technical writers, right? But technical writers, we're just getting started to provide, the features, and strike that balance between, a robust application that does the simple things really well, but also have the advanced features, like you mentioned, right? But the larger target audience, it's basically product and engineering teams, right? So I've been trying to understand like how technical writers do their job, and I've come to this conclusion that maybe 20% of the time is basically writing content, and 80% of the time is spent in meetings or going after the ones that have the information, right? So That being said, I think there's a larger audience because after we have the proper tool for technical writers, we can tap in those product and engineering teams and offer them a similar experience, like a tool built for developers, software documentation, not software documentation, software companies that build software. That's what I wanted to say. A similar experience for those, not only for technical writers, right? So you can go in so many other ways, either build another product, add on top of the existing product, but that's how we think, in the long run. So yeah, I think product and engineering teams, I'm sure they have more problems than just capturing documentation. So we can also solve some of those problems, maybe.
For sure, and I like that approach, right? If you're thinking about those teams, not just the tech writers, but how all those teams contribute and interact, it is a much larger audience, and the internal versus external docs is really on point as well. In fact, earlier, speaking of the internal use case, I think somebody saw an earlier post I wrote about Archbee and said that they started to use it for their own like API documentation materials and course and things that they were providing, or tech writer course, and really liked it. He was like, this is just what I needed. And to serve that simple use case of one person with their course kind of syllabus versus to also apply to an entire enterprise with all kinds of diverse roles is really quite a challenge to build a tool that meets all those needs. And it's exciting to see kind of Archbee come onto the scene. I think you add a great option for tech writers. I mean, we want tools that are going to be aligned with this API documentation trend, that are going to allow us to publish API docs in an attractive way, but also the tutorials and other stuff, and to reuse content and to not have to figure it out on our own. I mean, I don't want to have to get in there and code something from scratch and be like, well, I got to modify my layout files for my Jekyll or yeah.
Those are great options, and I've seen those go with some companies, but it depends on who's going to join the company. I've seen software companies that there were a team of 5 developers. Of course they will set up something, a open source project for their documentation. It's a couple of hours worth of work, right? But you would end up with a non-technical person that doesn't know Git, doesn't understand Markdown. So what do you do with them? You basically limit the pool of potential people that you can work with if you don't expand and try something like this. And what I've seen with our customers, at least at one point when they get larger, they basically use it for the internal wiki. So it's just better to have everything in one place at one point.
Yeah. Hey, Claudio, as we wrap up here, can you indicate where people can learn more and like what kind of free trials are available for people to experiment?
Yeah, we do offer a free trial with Archbee. You can go in, sign up, test the editor, everything we talked about here. You can go to archbee.com and you can get started from there. I think that's the best way you can do it. If you want to chat with us, there's also, we have weekly live product tours. This means if you don't have the time or, the energy to go in and test the product, see all the features, you can just sign up for a live product tour. And I'll be there sharing my screen, demoing the product, so I can answer any other questions that you might have. So yeah, that's the best way you can get in touch, archbee.com, and start a free trial.
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on to this podcast and for sharing your thoughts and insights. And I wish you the best of luck as well with Archbee and its continued growth.
Thanks, Tom. It's been great. Appreciate the invite. So thanks a lot.